The late afternoon sun painted the marble floors of the Lancaster estate in warm golden hues, but inside the sprawling mansion, there was an unsettling silence. The kind of silence that felt too deliberate. As if the house itself were holding its breath. David Lancaster hadn't planned on coming home that day. The flight from Tokyo had been last minute, spurred by something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way his 5-year-old son Ethan's voice trembled on their last video call, or maybe it was the heaviness in his chest that hadn't left since Amelia's funeral 6 months ago. Or maybe, just maybe, it was guilt. David had buried himself in business after his wife's sudden passing. Billion-dollar deals, global conferences, overnight flights. Anything to keep him from walking through the echoing halls of a home that no longer smelled like vanilla candles and fresh roses. Anything to keep him from remembering how she used to hum in the kitchen while making pancakes, or how she would dance barefoot in the living room with Ethan clinging to her hips, laughing like the world would never end. But now, with his suitcase in one hand and his phone switched off, he pushed open the front door, unannounced, uninvited even, and stepped inside the life he'd left behind. The housekeeper wasn't in sight. The guards hadn't seen him arrive. His private driver had dropped him at the gate and left. David liked it that way. Quiet, private, unexpected. He moved through the hallway, past the grand piano that hadn't been played in months, past the staircase Ethan used to race down every morning into his mother's arms. His shoes made no sound on the thick rug as he walked toward the sound of soft voices, one high and childish, the other low, feminine and almost singing. He stopped just outside the playroom where the door was half ajar. His brows furrowed. Inside on the carpeted floor sat Ethan, tiny legs crossed, toy train in hand, and behind him a woman. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun. Her white maid's uniform wrinkled and flecked with crayon smudges. She didn't notice David standing there. Her focus was completely on Ethan as she carefully wrapped a blanket around his small shoulders. But it wasn't just that. It was what she was saying. "You know," she whispered, brushing back his hair with a tenderness that made David's throat tighten. "Your mom used to tuck you in like this. She always said you were her little lion." Ethan looked up at her. "Did she tell you that too?" The maid smiled softly. "She told me everything." David's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't heard that nickname in months. Little Lion. Only Amelia called him that. Even David didn't know why. Maybe because of Ethan's wild curls or his fierce, fearless nature. The woman leaned forward then, placing a gentle kiss on Ethan's forehead. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're not alone. Not while I'm here." David stepped inside without realizing it. The floor creaked beneath him. The maid turned and froze. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She stood up slowly, her hand instinctively going to Ethan's shoulder as if to protect him. David stared. She wasn't who he expected. Younger than he remembered. Softer features. Deep brown eyes filled with something he couldn't read. Surprise, fear, maybe something else. "Mr. Lancaster," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't know you were coming." "I didn't either," he replied, his voice rough with jet lag and emotion. He looked down at Ethan, who blinked up at him sleepily. "Daddy?" Ethan asked, rubbing his eyes. "You're home." David dropped to one knee, arms already reaching. "Yeah, buddy. I'm home." The boy ran into his embrace without hesitation, burying his face in his father's chest. David held him tightly, closing his eyes against the sting. God, how long had it been since he'd held him like this? When he looked up again, the maid was still standing there, watching, waiting. "What were you doing just now?" he asked, more sharply than he meant to. She hesitated. He had a bad dream. He asked for his mom. David's eyes flicked to the blanket. A room. The softness in her voice. The way Ethan hadn't cried. He swallowed. "I've seen you before," he said. "But I don't remember your name." She straightened her shoulders. "It's Maria. Were you close to my wife?" Maria glanced at Ethan, who had dozed off against his father's chest. Then she looked back at David with a strange expression, one that held secrets. "She trusted me," she said simply. Something about the way she said it made David's skin prickle. He didn't press further. Not yet. But as he carried his sleeping son upstairs that night, David couldn't shake the image of Maria. The way she'd touched his son's hair, the way she'd spoken about Amelia, the nickname. And deep down he knew. This was no ordinary maid. And whatever truths she was hiding, they were about to change everything. David stood silently in the hallway just outside his son's bedroom. The soft sound of Ethan's breathing reached him through the crack in the door. He'd tucked the boy in just moments ago, yet his legs hadn't moved since. He leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets, eyes clouded with memory. The way Ethan had curled into him like he hadn't seen his father in years, that ache in his chest was back, gnawing and sharp. Downstairs, the house was beginning to settle into the usual nighttime hush. Distant footsteps, likely Maria's, moved gently across the kitchen tiles. She hadn't said much after their first exchange. She'd simply bowed her head, muttered a good night, and slipped away. But something in her eyes haunted him. David headed down the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the kitchen, she was there. She hadn't changed clothes. Still wore the same smudged uniform. She stood by the sink, rinsing out a small plastic cup Ethan must have used earlier. Her hands steady but her eyes far away. He leaned against the doorway. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, voice low. Maria didn't look at him. "Since just before Ethan turned 4. Amelia hired me." That struck him. Amelia had handled most of the household hiring, but she usually introduced David to new staff. Why hadn't she mentioned Maria? "And in all that time," he said slowly, "we never spoke." Maria smiled faintly. "You were always traveling." Fair point. But something still felt off. He walked in, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. He called out for his mom. Almost every night. Maria turned toward him now. "He asks if she's coming back. Maybe she forgot something. Sometimes he just lies there, looking at the ceiling, whispering her name." David gripped the water bottle tighter. "I try to comfort him the way she did," Maria said quietly. "Same songs. Same stories. Same blanket." He looked at her, eyes narrowing. "You said earlier that Amelia told you everything. What did you mean?" She hesitated. Then, she didn't have many people to talk to. Not ones who really listened. David's mouth went dry. "About what?" Maria leaned back against the counter. Her voice dropped lower, as if the walls themselves might be listening. About how lonely she was. About how the house never felt like a home anymore. How she was scared. Not for herself, but for Ethan. She worried he'd grow up feeling like a stranger to you. David's chest tightened. "She never said anything to me." "She tried," Maria said. "But you were too busy. You always were." It landed like a slap. He didn't respond, just looked away, jaw clenched. "She never stopped loving you," Maria added gently. But she was tired of being invisible. The silence that followed was unbearable. David finally broke it. "Why are you still here? After she died? You could have left." Maria's eyes met his. "Because Ethan needed someone who knew her. Someone who remembered the warmth in her laugh. The way she'd braid his hair for fun, even if he hated it. Someone who could keep her alive in the little things." Her voice wavered slightly, but she stood tall. David didn't know what to say. He left the kitchen without another word. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, shadows stretching across the room like quiet accusations. His mind played old memories. Amelia dancing barefoot, laughing in the rain, crying quietly at the edge of the bed when she thought he was asleep. He hadn't been asleep. He just didn't know what to do. Now it was too late. The next morning he found Maria and Ethan in the backyard. She was pushing him on the swing while he giggled, shouting, "Higher! Higher!" The scene stopped David in his tracks. She looked like she belonged there. Ethan looked happy. "Maria," he said as he approached. He turned. "Good morning, Mr. Lancaster." "Call me David," he said, almost without thinking. She nodded, surprised. "I want to talk," he said. "About staying. About Ethan. About everything." She studied his face. "Are you ready to hear the truth?" He looked at his son, then back at her. "Yes." And in her eyes, he saw something shift, like a door unlocking. Because the truth Maria carried wasn't just about comforting a grieving boy. It was about a secret Amelia had kept from him, a secret that would change the way he saw his son forever. David sat across from Maria in the sunroom, his gaze fixed on the delicate steam rising from his untouched coffee. The morning light spilled across the room in golden lines, but inside him, there was a storm brewing. Years of absence, guilt, and now, questions that refused to stay buried. Maria sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the garden where Ethan chased a butterfly. She seemed calm, but there was something in her posture, a readiness like a dam waiting to break. "You said Amelia was hiding something," David said. "What was it?" Maria didn't respond at first. She glanced at Ethan again, as if drawing courage from the boy's laughter. Then she spoke. "She was sick." David blinked. "What?" Maria nodded slowly. "She didn't tell you. But she knew something was wrong long before the diagnosis. She started getting dizzy spells, fatigue, night sweats. At first she thought it was stress or grief from her sister's death, but deep down she knew." David sat back stunned. "She never told me. Not once." "She was afraid," Maria said softly. "Afraid you'd see her differently. Afraid you'd panic. And more than that, she didn't want to become another responsibility. That's what she said." His heart dropped. The words pierced like a blade. "She started going to the hospital in secret. I went with her. She told me not to tell you, begged me." David's voice cracked. "And you listened." Maria looked down. "I didn't want to. Tried. But she was desperate. And then when the tests confirmed it, it was already stage 4. David stood up suddenly, pacing. "Why didn't I see it? I was her husband." "Because you weren't here," Maria said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were chasing meetings across time zones, David. Amelia needed someone who was present. That's what she found in me. Friend. A witness." He turned away, eyes burning. "God." Maria stood now too. "She didn't blame you. But she made me promise one thing, that if anything ever happened to her, I'd stay for Ethan." David was quiet for a long time. Then, "There's more, isn't there?" Maria exhaled slowly. "Yes." He turned. "What?" She hesitated. "The night she died, she left behind a letter. For you. And one for Ethan." "Where is it?" he asked urgently. Maria reached into her pocket and took out a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges. "She asked me to give it to you when you were ready." David took it with trembling hands and sat back down, staring at the envelope like it might explode. He tore it open, his breath shaky, and began to read. "My love, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things in person. And I'm sorry for that. I never wanted our story to end this way." The letter was pages long, filled with apologies, memories, confessions. But it was the final paragraph that struck like lightning. "There's something you should know about Ethan. Something I wanted to tell you myself, but never found the courage." David's hands stopped moving. His eyes locked with Maria's. "He's not mine, is he?" he whispered. Maria's silence was the answer. The room tilted. His heart thundered. "You knew." She nodded. "Amelia told me when Ethan was a baby. She had a brief affair. When your marriage was falling apart. She was going to tell you, but then you came back. You forgave her, even though you didn't know what for. And she chose silence." David's voice cracked like glass. "And you kept it from me all these years." "I was protecting Ethan," Maria said, tears finally welling in her eyes. She begged me to. And then when she passed, I couldn't let you look at that boy with anything less than love. David sat there shattered. Ethan wasn't his by blood. The boy he'd held as a baby, fed, bathed, carried on his shoulders, wasn't his son. Or was he more his son than anyone else could ever be? He stared out the window again. Ethan stood there, holding a dandelion, grinning. And just like that, the pain melted into something else. Not joy, not peace, but something deeper, something closer to truth. He whispered, "I don't care." Maria looked at him, startled. "I don't care if I'm not his biological father," David said. "He's mine. In every way that matters." Maria let out a breath she'd been holding for years. He looked at her then. Really looked. "You stayed when you didn't have to," he said. "You carried this alone. For him. For her. For me." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. David reached across the table, placing a hand gently over hers. "Thank you," he said, voice raw, "for saving my son." 3 months had passed since David read the letter. Life in the Lancaster estate had changed. Not in the ways money could show, but in the way warmth had returned to the halls. The silence that once echoed now rang with laughter, tiny footsteps, and Ethan's endless questions about the world. The walls that had once mourned Amelia's absence now held her memories like a quiet flame that never stopped glowing. Maria was still there, but she wasn't just the maid anymore. David had promoted her to full-time caretaker and legal guardian of Ethan when he traveled. He gave her her own suite in the house. And more than anything, he treated her with the deep respect of someone who had witnessed his life unravel and helped piece it back together. Ethan still didn't know the full truth. Not yet. He was too young. But David had decided something important. When the time came, he would be the one to tell him. And he would tell him with love, not shame. It was a rainy afternoon when David sat alone in his study, flipping through Amelia's old journals. Maria had given them to him just days ago, explaining they were found tucked in a locked drawer of her closet. Inside were pieces of a woman David wished he had known better, pages filled with sketches of Ethan, poetry about motherhood, and thoughts she never dared speak aloud. And in the back of the final journal, tucked in an envelope, was another letter. It was addressed to Maria. David hesitated, then knocked gently on her door. Maria opened it slowly, surprised to see him holding the envelope. "I found this," he said. She took it with trembling hands, her breath catching when she recognized Amelia's handwriting. "I haven't read it," David added. "It's yours." Maria sat down on the edge of her bed, fingers shaking as she opened the envelope. David stayed silently in the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but not ready to walk away. Maria began to read. Her eyes darted over the paper, then stilled. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began reading aloud, voice unsteady. "Dear Maria, if you're reading this, it means you kept your promise. You stayed. You loved him like he was your own. And you protected both of them from truths they weren't ready to carry. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty, but I'll forever be grateful for it. There's something I want to say. Something I never had the courage to tell you in life." Maria's lip trembled. "You are Ethan's biological mother." David's breath stopped. He stepped closer. "What?" Maria looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. The letter continued. "I couldn't bear the shame of the affair. And I couldn't face the idea of raising the child while knowing the truth, that he was a product of my failure, not my marriage. But you had just lost your baby. I saw how broken you were. And somehow, somewhere between grief and healing, we made a decision. We said nothing. We let the world believe he was mine. And you let me raise him as if he were truly my own. You are the most selfless person I have ever known. And if I could do it all over again, I would have told David. I would have told the world. But if you ever read this, and if he ever knows, then let it be known now. Ethan is yours. And you deserve to be called his mother, fully and completely." Maria clutched the letter to her chest, shaking. David sat beside her, his mind spinning. She told me he was hers, Maria whispered. I remember the night he was born. I held him. And then she took him back. And said it would be best if I pretended none of it happened. David was speechless. You let her do that. She was grieving. Scared. I loved her. I owed her everything. And when I saw the way she held Ethan, I thought maybe he'd be better off with her. David shook his head slowly. But he wasn't. He needed you too. Tears streamed down her face. I never stopped loving him. David reached for her hand again, something he'd done so often now that it felt natural. Then love him openly, fully. Be his mother. He already sees you that way. She looked up at him through blurred eyes. What will you tell him? The truth, David said softly. That his mother was brave. That she loved him so much she stayed in the shadows just to protect him. And that no matter who his parents were by blood, he was raised by people who would die for him. She looked at him, her eyes searching. And you? I'm his father, David said without hesitation. Maybe not by biology, but by every choice I've made, and every heartbeat I've spent loving him. Maria broke down into quiet sobs. David wrapped an arm around her shoulder and held her. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel like a museum filled with ghosts. Felt like a home again. That evening, Ethan lay curled between Maria and David on the couch, a bedtime book resting on his chest. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The fire crackled low. Are you gonna leave again, Daddy? Ethan asked drowsily. David looked at Maria. Then at Ethan. No, buddy. Not anymore. And Miss Maria. David smiled. She's not going anywhere either. Ethan smiled, eyes already closing. Good. I love her. Maria stroked his curls gently. I love you too. And as the boy drifted into sleep, nestled between the two people who had once been strangers, but were now bound by love deeper than blood, everything that had once been broken began to heal. Not with secrets, but with truth. And with love.